Hello, friends, and welcome to episode 225 of the Noclip podcast this week. No Crewcast. We're all too busy playing Oblivion, I'm guessing. That's what's happening. I've personally put in like 20 hours in a week, so I am Oblivion pilled like a sicko. We put a little video up on the YouTube channel. We have a YouTube channel, you know. Noclip has a YouTube channel. We dabble in YouTube. We put up footage of our 2018 Bethesda documentaries. Basically, did a roundup. I needed an excuse to stop playing Oblivion, so I spent Saturday afternoon. I had like a free afternoon, and I was like, I could do yard chores, bit of gardening, but nah. Decided to cut together a little Oblivion video instead. We're not going to talk about Oblivion today, though. I got a special developer interview. I managed to get some time with Ben Fisher, who's the head of design over at Rebellion. Who put together Atomfall, which you may remember back on episode 219 at the end of March. I was talking about Atomfall. Rebellion, of course, a studio with a long history of making first-person games all the way back to Alien vs. Predator, of course. In more modern days, the Sniper Elite franchise has been sort of their bread and butter. But Atomfall, you know, new IP, different type of game, open world RPG, basically, but designed really economically and smartly and with some really fantastic world building. I had a lot of questions for Ben because I think I talked about it in my sort of impressions on the podcast that it was a game that was making a lot of just very smart design decisions to try and create something that was really trusting of the player's intelligence and wasn't overly, you know, systems heavy or you know, everything had a light touch. Like the inventory had a light system and the combat had a light system and it made for like a kind of a breezy experience. I'll be honest, kind of like not to be just bring everything back to Oblivion, but you know, Oblivion when you play it in 2025 as well, it feels like it's from a different era of first-person RPG where you just didn't have like 10,000 things that you could do all the time. And Atomfall strikes a really interesting balance, kind of more so than like the Metro games, but like less so than, I don't know, Stalker, you know what I mean? It occupies a sort of a very unique space. And I had a great conversation with Ben, which you're about to listen to, where we dove into a bunch of that and really just how the history of Rebellion and the games they've made, really the Sniper Elite series, sort of informed a lot of those decisions. So yes, it's a very fun interview. I had a blast talking to Ben, and I hope you enjoy it too. And I want to do a special shout out, of course, to all of our incredible Battle Pass holders. I did not ask Ben to read them out. Apologies. You'll have to have me do it again. And the Irishman. Yut, Dwayne the Rock Lobster, Anthony Thomas, Nico Passateri, It's a Me, Ferrario, Penelope Hayes, Senator Armstrong, Harry Flanagan, Juice, Arno, Jose R., Nat Pearson, James Brown, Mark Rojas, Tucker Morgan, David McGarry, Sven Hooster, Pez, John Akers, Ewint Nate, Tim Robinson, Forrest Pruitt, Jonathan Kremen, Eric Hamilton Schneider, Christoph Fatui, Cameron Ladd, Zachary Snader, Alex Goucher of the Gouchers, George Zakotis, Jacob Godserve, Entheogen, James Med, Tohir Teliev, and Ryson. Thank you all so much for your support of our work here at Noclip. What's coming in the pipeline? Disco Elysium is getting worked on currently. And our Everbloom series as well. We'll be premiering that one. So make sure that you are a patron supporter to watch the patron show all about them, or even better, become an early access fan and get access to, extended early access of all the docs and also extended interviews like our Todd Howard and Emil Pagliarello ones that are in the Bethesda video from 2018, or new stuff like our bonus feature from our recent Dwarf Fortress series. There's loads of stuff in there. We're doing our best over here trying to make these documentaries, so we really appreciate any support you can in these difficult times. Not as difficult as the poor people stuck inside that Atomfall situation, which we're going to talk about right now. Ben Fisher, thank you so much for joining us on the podcast this week. How are things over at Rebellion? Has it been a month since Atomfall came out?
Very nearly a month, yeah. I think it's in 2 days' time, it's a month.
Okay, so you're going to have your little party.
Yes, yeah, we're having a little party next week, actually, yeah. And it's great. It's everyone's very pleasantly surprised by the reception to Atomfall. You're always optimistic, you're always hopeful, but there's aspects of the game that were very experimental when we were developing them, and they seem to have struck a chord with people. So you never really know until the game comes out. So we're all very happy. Still kind of evaluating what that means because it's such a like a positive reception.
Yeah, it's. I think it pleasantly surprised people who were playing it as well, because it is this sort of interesting combination of design choices that really had me on my toes. Like a game like this, you're sort of expecting to easily put it in a box with some other type of, first person shooter / RPG thing, and it somehow managed to sort of defy those expectations and carve out its own idea, I guess, of how to play one of these games. Let's go back to, as early as you can on this project. The studio is known for a couple of different franchises, sort of historically. I grew up in Ireland playing, classic Rebellion games in the 90s and early aughts. But in sort of more recent time, it's been Sniper Elite and the Evil Genius series as well, of course. Where did the idea for, not just doing another shooter, because you sort of already have a pretty well-established one, come from? And also a new IP, which is always a bit of a risk in and of itself.
A couple of things fed into that. One is that although Rebellion's well known for Sniper Elite primarily, Evil Genius obviously did well as well, but Zombie Army series, Strange Brigade, we're always trying something a little bit interesting on the edges of that kind of core stuff, just to see what sticks, to see what's exciting. We always want to try new ideas and see what's fun. So that's one aspect of it. The other was Jason Kingsley, one of the founders and owners of Rebellion, notice that there are a load of different games in what you could call kind of like a quarantine genre, right? A load of kind of post-nuclear devastation games where the players finds himself in that situation and they're trying to survive. So you notice that there's a few games in that category, but none set around the world's first major nuclear disaster, which was the Windscale fire. So that's better known in the UK than it is in other countries. So it's understandable why it wasn't a trigger point for anyone else. So we looked at that theme and that setting. And the sort of games that Rebellion makes are typically kind of broad and pulpy, with a British slant to the tone and the fiction. We prioritize sandbox freedom for the player, not telling the player what to do, maybe giving them an objective and then giving them freedom in how they achieve it. So we had this kind of melting pot of influences. It also felt like, well, very early in production, actually, it was more like a kind of skunkworks project, a very small team looking at that brief and saying, well, if we wanted to do a game that was like an RPG, we would need a conversation system. We would need an inventory system. We would need to have NPCs that aren't just Nazis trying to shoot you. Because in Sniper Elite, you're either Carl or you're a Nazi, right? So to have a system where there are allegiances and factions and stuff like that, it's like a new toolkit. So before we even had a coherent idea of what the end result would look like, we were building these tools to allow ourselves to explore. And then from a aesthetic perspective as well, Sniper Elite is set in World War II battlefields, and then Zombie Army is kind of derived from that. To some extent, Strange Brigade was derived from that as well. So we obviously didn't have like the Lake District that we could just pop out of the flat pack and start assembling. So part of the process was visiting the area, gathering, doing photogrammetry, so gathering 3D scans of assets in the Lake District itself, also looking at how we would make environments that had that tone. So lots of kind of chopping up ingredients to get ready to cook.
One of the things that sort of, at least from my sort of layman's perspective, felt like it probably emerged from the Sniper Elite stuff is the fact that you don't have one open map. You have these sort of, I think it's 5, is it distinct sort of areas, and then obviously you've got sort of subterranean and other hidden aspects in the game. Is that the case? Is that something that just came from the way you guys have historically sort of made games? Was there ever a push to do one big open world? Because one of the things that's really interesting from playing Atomfall is you think you might like lose something by not having it as an open world, but you actually gain quite a lot of sort of specific sort of design tools from actually having them in these distinct locations that are sort of boxed off. But yeah, is that where that came from?
It's a good question. The answer is a little bit indirect, I suppose,
Good.
in that when you're, like I was just saying, you kind of make a toolkit of what you want to use to build the game that you're trying to make. So you're always trying to balance what have we already got, what do we know how to do, and where do we want to try something new. And that seemed like a place where like the obvious answer is to do one connected sandbox. But in order to do that, you need to make the areas very large to be able to then have breathing room between each of the beats of the game. If you look at Sniper Elite, what we know how to do is densely concentrated, interconnected sandboxes where every detail matters. So from that experience and from that lineage, we sort of said, what does that look like if it's a sandbox, like an RPG? It meant that each of the maps could be strongly themed. It meant that we could double down on detail and content, make it all interconnect, make it all matter. So by looking at it in that sense, it started to trigger some of the most interesting ideas in the game, of it being this sort of spider web of everything connected to everything else. There was actually a version of the game that was structured more like a Metroidvania game earlier in production. So if you think of those sandbox maps, the flow of the game at the time was something like you would enter one of those sandbox maps and uncover a tool or a key or some information that would allow you access to like the next sandbox map in the sequence. And each of the maps would have like what we called at the time quest dungeons, like major locations which would progress the narrative. So over time, it would gradually unfurl. And we got the game sort of running in that state. And it had a more traditional quest system at the time as well. So it was really building with elements that you might recognize from other places, because that was the fastest way to make something that connected together coherently. When we played it, it felt too guiding for our like creative pillars, that sense of player ownership, that sense of freedom. It felt too much like we were telling you what the sequence of the story was. We were telling you that other people had a cool adventure and you were kind of turning up after the fact and unpicking someone else's story. You didn't feel so much of a sense of ownership. That's when we said, well, what happens if we just like philosophically just unlock everything and let the player piece it together in their own way? What happens if we remove a traditional quest system? And that's when we got into the really juicy problem solving stuff. So that, to come back to your initial question, building those densely concentrated sandboxes and then making each of them strongly themed gave us a really interesting context to then come up with what an Atomfall was.
That's remarkable that it had this more sort of unlock it in a specific order, which again you would sort of assume like that's sort of how a lot of games work, and obviously from a design perspective, it allows you the guardrails of making sure that the player's sort of having the fun, at the right times. I did think it was an incredibly sort of brave decision to let you go anywhere. Was it always that binary that it was sort of like this? Oh, we have this version where you have to unlock specific areas in a specific order. To hey, let's let the fuckers go wherever they want. Because I guess to a certain extent, there's only so many places you can go at the start of the game, but that seems like a really difficult design challenge, especially because your opening is pretty short. Like the part where you have the player on sort of guide rails in that initial area is only a couple of minutes long.
We wanted to get the player to the sandbox as fast as possible. And again, it's a very fair question. We had the more guided version of the game, and we wanted to give the player that sense of freedom. So we kind of said to ourselves, what's the fastest we can get the player to that sandbox freedom? What's the openest that freedom can be? And then, set that boundary and then retreat from it if you have to. And we found that there was a solution where we didn't have to. So, that was the bit that was risky. So I'm glad that it comes across as brave, because that was kind of the, let's try it and see what happens. There was no guarantee players would even be able to engage with it. So it was definitely a big risk, but it felt like a legitimate risk to tackle because it was the most honest expression of the creative pillars of the game and of rebellion in general. So like you say, with that opening, we spent a lot of time doing two things. One was location scouting. So by this point, we had a selection of sandbox maps. And the reason we've got subterranean interiors as well is that it gave us the building blocks that you could kind of shuffle them around a bit. It's easier to move the entrance to a bunker than it is to move an entire interior. So it was a good bit of flexibility.
Right.
So with that structure in mind, we wanted to find the best opening location that gave you access to a load of interesting places, that gave you a sense of unguided, you come out and you can go up or down the hill at the most basic level, but also you can see the overall objective and you can see steps towards it. So it builds on all this learning from Sniper Elite. But we scouted around the game to try and find the best spot. At one point, it was the back end of Casterfell Woods, just because there was a nice spot down there and you fed through a spooky wood and those sorts of things. So we tried different structures that gave you a different emotional experience, and that seemed to be the best fit. And then the content of the interior itself, we went through a fast, aggressive iteration process of what's the smallest version of the emotional tone that we want Atomfall to have, that gives the player enough of an understanding of the mechanics of the game that when we let them go, they have enough of an understanding of what's expected of them. So having that character appear immediately and present you with, to some extent, a moral quandary. Like, you can help him or not, you can kill him or not. You can blackmail him, making sure that you've got this sense of tone range, and then having a character who's trying to kill this guy you've just helped and doesn't necessarily want to get in a fight with you, but maybe you want to get in a fight with him because you liked the guy you just crossed paths with. This kind of murky complexity seemed like the most distilled version of the core pillars of the game. And then we let you out into the sandbox and go, right, now you know what an Atomfall is. Kind of good luck. So it was definitely a risk, but it was the cleanest expression of the pillars of the game, so it seemed like a reasonable risk to tackle.
Right, yeah. Thank you. They're well explained. I think I sort of also see how, in a game that's giving you so much player choice, the last thing you want to do is have this extended sort of guardrailed thing at the start. It's sort of lying about what the game is, I guess, to a certain extent. How did you guys... Sorry, go on.
I was just going to say, the earlier in the experience you are, the larger an influence every single beat has on your interpretation of what the whole game is about, because you've not got anything else to go on. So if you set up the wrong set of expectations when you let the player loose, they'll be playing the wrong game, and then they won't have an enjoyable experience. So there were versions that had more combat, or there were versions that told you exactly what to do more, and we found that when we did that, when we took the leash off, players just sort of floundered a little bit. And for some players, there's still some of that because it's unusual for the game to be so open. But we've structured the game in a way that means you have to confront that a little bit and kind of decide whether the game's for you at that moment. So yeah, there was a lot of nudging about this exact specifics of every single detail in that start sequence to frame the right mental model in your head.
Right. It's like raising a child, It's just like in
exactly
like a 20-minute period. How did you guys come up with the themes for the various sandboxes? It was one of the aspects that I enjoyed the most. It felt like sort of channel swapping between different sort of BBC sci-fi movies or something, or not to say that they were direct to TV, but it just had like it felt they felt weird but sort of grounded and familiar in other ways. Yeah, how did you come up with the vibes of each area?
That layered up over time. So there's two different answers to that. So you're asking great questions that have fractal answers or like holographic answers.
No, you're just a kind and considerate interviewer. You don't give the easy answer. You're giving us the sort of the more thoughtful one.
Interesting answer. Yeah. So the different answers to that question are, when we researched the area, we wanted to make sure there was kind of almost like a theme park distillation of the details that make somewhere feel Lake District-y. So having like rolling dales, having a nice little village with a tea shop and a church up the hill and a pub beside the church and phone boxes and all that. That's like an agglomeration of 3 or 4 different real villages into like the most concentrated version. Having those kind of woods, having the rolling farmland as well, was like an exaggeration of the real kinds of locations you find if you go through the Lake District. So that was layer 1. Then we went through quite a long iterative process of finding a framing that felt right, that had those kind of pulpy beats that kind of define Rebellion games, but also felt coherent. So we had concept art and visualization for different factions, but not quite a match for exactly where they would go in the game. So we're building these pieces individually and trying to find a configuration that's slotted together. And what we ended up doing is layering on top of the sandbox maps, the quite realistic sandbox maps we had, with these like pulpy storytelling beats. So an example being in Casterfell Woods, there's a great big castle ruin, and there's kind of like maple bunting that comes out of it to draw you into this sort of folk horror environment. And then these druids practicing some kind of nefarious rituals and what looks like stuffing mushrooms in the mouths of people that they've got strung up. So those kind of local details we layered on top of a landscape that we built. And the creative challenge is kind of what I called boiling the frog. And that is taking the player on a journey that allows them to build up an understanding of the space in layers so that it feels natural when they get to the more outlandish stuff. That kind of plot trajectory you get in an episode of Doctor Who, where they get to the weird spacey stuff at the tail end of the episode, right? But you've acclimatized by that point, so it seems reasonable. The most visual example of that being the village itself, where we had a lovely village and it was like a realistic village, but it didn't have that kind of 60s speculative British sci-fi, British speculative fiction twist to it. And it felt like having the big robot stomping about in the village would be the perfect fit.
Right.
If you turn a corner, there's a great big robot standing there. You're just going to go, why is there a robot there? And it seems stupid, right? So we didn't want that reaction. So as you make your way into the village, you have to go through those great big concrete walls. There are various checkpoints you step through. There's guys in kit-bashed armor that makes them look like they're defending the village from something outside, because they're all facing out and then wearing this sort of ridiculous armor. So it's like, why are these guys wearing this and defending a tea shop? And arranging the details in a way that made that seem coherent means that by the time you get to the robot, it's easier to accept how the overall fiction fits together. In fact, I didn't expect this to become a relevant point of reference for me, but I looked at the history of and photos of the Troubles. Right. Because it's an occupying
I can totally see
empire force. It's effectively, it's as if Doctor Who in the 60s was trying to tell a story about the Troubles, right? So you have to treat it delicately because it's a serious matter, but also using that sci-fi, that pulp storytelling lets you tackle those issues in a kind of in a context that makes it easier for people to not become guarded about. So we use that same philosophy to build up these layers of legitimate history and then sci-fi-ified versions of that history and how it all slotted together. But it was a very layered process, so very built up a step at a time so that it felt like it slotted together. It fit very nicely with the philosophy of letting the player go anywhere, because it meant that the overall narrative was like a jigsaw and you were piecing it together.
Right.
The other trick we used is that the aspects of world building that require you to understand the world a bit more are physically deeper in the ground. So that not only is that got that kind of metaphorical value of being uncovering the truth, but also it means that we can assume the player has enough of an understanding of the game that once they get down there, they understand the mechanics of the game and they have enough of an understanding of the lore of the game to, understand why this stuff is cool and interesting. Yeah. So again, a lot of trust.
I was about to say, trust is the word. Like it's a lot of, I've lots of other questions just about the design side, but just on that trust, like, what does that look like from a production standpoint? Are you doing a lot of, like, is it internal QA? Are you doing play testing with folks? Like, how are you gauging it? Because so much of this seems to be trying to figure out what the player's first time through sort of feels like.
Yeah, we did a lot of internal play testing primarily because Rebellions, we've got several games on the go at one time.
Right.
But there's enough of us that we can bring in fresh people that haven't seen the game. There are fewer of us than you would expect, I think, given the scope of games that we produce, but enough of us to be able to legitimately playtest and then also compare people's playtest experience to the philosophical pillars of Rebellion, that sense of openness and sandbox freedom and player agency. So yeah, a lot of targeted play tests and then careful analysis of how people reacted to the game. And some of it as well, I would say, is some of it comes from the creative philosophy of Jason and Chris Kingsley, who want the player to have that sense of freedom and openness. My hypothesis would be, if I was working somewhere else and I was working for an external client, they would be much less likely to be comfortable with saying maybe the player will finish the game in half an hour and that's just fine. Right? Because places I've worked in the past and historically, if you're working for an external client, they want to guarantee a specific runtime and that all players see all of the content to justify the dev cost kind of thing.
Yeah, absolutely.
So to say that player agency and freedom is more important is a very Rebellion thing, and it was great to kind of take advantage of that and then run with it, go as far as possible in that direction just to see what it's like.
An extension of that, and I think one of the elements that definitely sort of surprised and delighted players, I think surprisingly delighted them, is how you guys tackle quests, I guess, or the sort of, I don't want to say lack thereof, but just I think players are so used to a very particular way of engaging with, quests and rewards and story that when somebody out there decides to do it in a slightly different way, it's remarkably novel. And I guess it sounds like it's part of that same philosophy of trusting the player and sort of giving them the power to solve it. But can you give us an idea of, elevator pitch, the way you guys approached quests? I guess
Sure.
you call them leads, right? Is that what it was? Yeah.
This was one of the most difficult creative problems to solve. So
I
I'm
bet.
more than happy to.
Yeah.
Like I said before, we had a version of the game that had something more like a traditional quest system. And you ended up doing that thing that it's so easy to do of just watch the quest marker, jog in the direction of the quest marker and not engage with the sandbox. And it felt like the player would by default be missing the most interesting stuff in the game just because of that instinct. That kind of, you've acclimatized to other games that use that structure that have got 300 hours of content and the whole point is just to consume lots of content quickly. But we wanted a more concentrated experience where every detail mattered. So we had to fight against that instinct. We had the version with traditional quests. We took them out. And then we had the problem of, right, how do we give the player something to do in this sandbox? If you give the player a sandbox and no guidance, it's really hard to motivate them, right? They want that structure. So we took I'm not saying this was easy. This was, like I say, one of the most challenging creative problems to solve in the game. It took a lot of trying stuff out and iterating, but we looked at Sniper Elite and said, how have we solved this problem in the past? Because in Sniper, you've got an objective, but you're also kind of given freedom in how to achieve it. So how did we motivate the player in Sniper Elite? Towards the end of Sniper Elite 5, some of that structure had started to form a very interesting shape where you had an objective, you had methods to achieve that objective. And as you explored the environment, you might find more methods. So you got to blow up a great big Nazi wonder weapon, and there's a way that you arrive knowing about, and then there's 3 or 4 hidden in the map, and you may or may not find them. So that's the structure of one Sniper Elite mission. So we looked at that and said, what happens if we make the entire game one super giant Sniper Elite mission? So increase the resolution of the fractal by one more iteration. So even to begin with, you've not got an objective. We wanted to not tell you who you were. We wanted to not tell you how you relate to the other characters. And that comes with the problem of how do you get started even? So this is why we've got characters telling you you're trapped and you're trapped and there will be people that can tell you how to find a way out. And then also the kind of optional, but everyone goes for it, lead of Oberon must die. That gives you a couple of things to explore in the game world. But we don't tell you what to do about them. This was the kind of philosophical shift of how do we tell the player what to do without telling them what to do, was to tell them the facts. So they're an investigator, they're exploring, and if the metaphor was you're making notes about what people have told you. So someone might want you to cover up a murder for the sake of argument. A traditional quest system would say, go and talk to the guy to cover up the murder. But that tells you something about the quest. That tells you whether it's the main path or an optional. It tells you whether it's the goodie or the baddie path and all these kind of clarifying details. But we wanted you to legitimately take a second to evaluate how the ambiguity is resolved, because it feels like folk horror, because it feels like 60s British sci-fi, which had that kind of Cold War edge. How do we make the player stop and take a second and go, I'm not sure about this. So we framed each detail just as a fact. And it's up to you how you resolve that fact. One of the ways is to shoot everyone. Right? So because the structure of the game means that there's not main characters, and therefore you can kill anybody you like, or you can ignore them. The situation has resolved into a kind of stability, and people welcome you into the conversation because maybe you can do something for them. Maybe you can tip that instability. So you're not a superhero, but you're a variable in a kind of unstable equilibrium. And it was a big chunk of work. And once we had that structure in place, we had to make sure that there were interconnections between every part of the game. Or rather, we didn't have to do this, but this felt like the most natural way to make leads work as a system. No matter where you engage with this kind of spider web of leads, everything connects to everything else. So eventually you'll find your way back to the Windscale plant and resolving the mystery, regardless of what route you take. So we then had to make sure for any kind of local narratives that happen, they somehow connect into the bigger picture. Might just be a couple of little threads. One of the pleasant side effects we found is that changed your perspective on what would be a side quest in another game. As you keep investigating the leads, you learn more and more about the game world and go, well, what he said sounded reasonable, but now I know about what faction he's working for. Right. Maybe I don't trust them, and that changes how you make decisions. And then the last piece of the puzzle was making sure that regardless of what the player does, they're going to stumble across some leads eventually. So we seeded leads everywhere we possibly could. And we have mechanisms like the PA system in the village or the PA system in like some of the bunkers as well. Unavoidable leads. So even if you go on a killing spree, there's still a source of some clues that can get the ball rolling and help the player investigate through the game.
A phone might ring somewhere that requires
you can't shoot
to
a guy on the far end of a phone.
Yeah, exactly. It's funny. That was my next question, was how you resolved, I guess, sort of narrative cul-de-sacs. But it sounds like that was a big part of it, was connecting all this stuff up and making sure that there was always sort of a way back to the interchange, which I guess was always the sort of central mystery. What I loved about the lead stuff, and it really made the sort of multiple sandbox thing work even better, was I just was surprised how much you gain from that, from having these distinct areas, because like the leads then are sort of somewhat divided up. So you kind of know when you're in an area what to be looking for. It also allowed you to sort of not waste map size by having these transition points. Like it made sense that like, oh, the druids are in control of this because there's only like a couple of doors into this area. So that's why they're so comfortable here, you know what I mean? Whereas in an open world game, it would be ridiculous to have them wandering around like feet from the village, you know? Yeah. There was all these additives that you got from each one of them. And you mentioned it already, but the fact that, like you said, like even all the esoteric druids or any of the other folks in the prison and stuff, every time you did a side quest, it felt like you were understanding more about the world, which was sort of the main quest, was just understanding what was going on, I guess, like knowledge.
And then deciding how you relate to it. Exactly. Right. Yeah. So that was part of the 60s sci-fi vibe. Also like the John Wyndham cozy catastrophe of somebody kind of stumbling into something cataclysmic that's already happened, arriving as people are trying to pick up the pieces and then seeing how they fit into it. We didn't want to tell you the correct interpretation of the environment. We found it more interesting and more kind of aligned with the British storytelling traditions to make a messy, ambiguous situation where there aren't any goodies, there aren't any baddies. Everyone's got a perspective and they're all right from their perspective. And you've just got to decide where you fit into that. So as a result of that, what you say is true, that every lead you uncover helps you have a more complete picture. And then it's up to you how you relate to that picture. Right. All the different people have got different, the people that will offer you an escape from the quarantine zone effectively require you to align philosophically with their outlook in order to, and then you prove that you align, and then that's how you escape. That was a conscious choice of you have to decide that they are the least of several evils.
How did you guys approach combat? Because obviously Sniper Elite, very combat focused game, sort of weaponry focused, range focused game. And I assume there were very, sort of clear design reasons why you didn't necessarily want to have a high-powered sniper be the main character of this game. But tell us about the puzzle, I guess, of figuring out the combat in here, how much ammo you want to give the player, how much inventory space, and then how much melee was going to be in this.
Yeah, that wasn't straightforward either. That was one of the cases where our existing knowledge worked against us to some extent, because the team knows very well how to make Sniper Elite encounters. Sniper Elite maps feel like an open sandbox, but really they're 6 or 7 arenas interconnected in multiple different routes. And the core loop is you're the tiger in the undergrowth, right? You're observing, you're targeting the enemies, you're piecing together a strategy on how to take them down without being seen. So it's a puzzle game from a certain perspective. And to begin with, we kind of automatically made that game because we know how to do it, and it's and we know it's fun, right? Yeah. So we had to work against that. We had to change how we populated enemies so that there are a random sprinkling of placed enemies and then roving patrols that are in very, very random routes. So there's never a perfect solution. You're always working with incomplete knowledge, doing the best you can in a situation, a murky situation, because that was the one of the kind of philosophies of the overall structure of the game. We just covered how that relates to the lead system. We wanted the combat to feel the same. In Sniper Elite, you're a superhero effectively. You're like a 1950s. You are a sniper rifle, like to the extent that the Master Chief isn't really a character. He's just an effective
gun.
killing machine, a walking gun. Exactly. Yes, Carl Fairburn's not dissimilar. Right, he's a World War II sniper rifle. And we wanted you to relate emotionally to this differently. We wanted it to feel like 60s British speculative fiction. And more often than not, you've got a kind of Quatermass-ish figure, or like Number 6 in The Prisoner, some kind of outsider who's thrust into a situation, who's trying to piece it together. You also get a lot of, not necessarily specifically British and 60s, but like detective fiction is a kind of an everyman who's got an iron will, who thrusts his face in situations where it's not welcome and he takes a beating for it. But in the pursuit of a murky truth, which when uncovered makes everyone feel a bit worse, but at least the truth's out. So that kind of, that tone of you being more like a normal person instead of a superhero, like a trained military character. It's not a war zone, it's more like a pub brawl. So we wanted a messy mix of melee and ranged combat. It felt more British as well. Like you're in rural Britain, there might be farmers with shotguns, there might be an occupying military force which has guns because they've occupied this place and they're trying to keep the peace. So they would have arrived with guns to enforce the peace. But every fight isn't going to resolve with a gunfight. And we decided to sort of run with that a bit and see how that felt, make you panic and mix up options and make bad calls because of time pressure, because it aligned with the overall tone goals of the game, the overall kind of setting goals. So it meant that there was a real kind of economy design challenge of making sure if you got into a gunfight, you had enough to get on with, but you couldn't just fire completely freely, that you had the tools to get out of a situation where you'd panicked and used your last of your ammo. And then at the same time, we didn't want to enforce a particular playstyle on the player. So we wanted to give them these tools and then give them the opportunity to stock up on ammo and improve their gun and choose their moment to start off a fight. And mechanics like pointing a gun at a guy who doesn't have a gun, so he backs off. So that you can choose whether to escape a fight or not. It was all like just following the pillars of the game, following the tone of the game, and then adding these layers that felt appropriate. Another point of tone reference that felt interesting was the movie Children of Men.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah. From the perspective of an everyman trying to survive in the middle of a hostile and dangerous situation.
Yeah.
So we looked at that and said, well, that feels brutal and messy and like you're just trying desperately to survive and not like doing so with imperfect knowledge and without the resources you really need. What if we lean in that way? What do we find? So that's where some of the most interesting stuff came from on that side of the game, I think.
Well, it was really cool, like having patrols sort of tell you to go away and not just engage with you immediately,
Yeah.
It.
Effectively, it's a detective game, right? As the mechanics of the game became coherent, it became, and the lead system is when it became clear that that's really what the game was about. And in that structure, like a detective, whether that's like a BBC drama detective or like a film noir detective, they don't start guns blazing. The more and more they push into a situation, they get pushed back by people who don't want them entering there. But that's not where it starts tonally. And we would also fall into the trap of making the player play in their default style. If you follow the quest marker and then there's some baddies firing guns at you, you fire back and then you move to the quest marker.
Right.
And you don't engage with the process of forming your own perspective on the mystery and what you think is the right interpretation of that mystery.
It's funny how much you have to sort of unlearn things for players or don't give them the opportunity to fall into sort of established habits. I know another one of those, I guess, is I'm playing right now, they just dropped Oblivion's remaster yesterday at time of recording, which is a game that I forgot. You can fast travel to places you've never been to immediately. I totally forget. Like even that seems like something you don't do in modern game. You know, you at least have to go there to first fast travel. And I was like, oh, this is crazy. But I'm also like, oh, this was the first like large open world first person game. They were terrified that people would be bored of covering ground. There is no fast travel in Atomfall, traditional fast travel, I guess. You do have sort of a shortcut system, let's say, that emerges from players playing with the game. I kind of think I know the answer to this now, just because you've sort of laid out the sort of core pillars of this game and the design ethos you were going from. So I won't ask you necessarily how you came to that decision, but was there a tension to ever give a sort of a more traditional fast travel ability to players, especially near the end of the game where maybe they're doing a little bit more crisscrossing than they would have been at the start?
For any mechanic in the game where we did something that wasn't traditional, there was tension and friction, because it's easy to worry that players might need it. So the way that we resolved that is we said, well, what are the pillars of the game? And let's make the choice that aligns itself with the pillars of the game. So in our case, like you say, you unlock a series of shortcuts, but also we still want there to be unexpected instability in those shortcuts. So there might be enemies we don't expect them before, and you get new tools. So there's new things you can unlock and explore as you travel through a place repeatedly. You might uncover new leads that you've not uncovered before. So there is still layers of new things happening. But we didn't want to have that feeling of you kind of like sprinting to the next plot beat, because part of it is that being immersed in a difficult situation, that kind of anxiety of being on the back foot, of having to be observant, like just the right amount of stress and tension on the player, like sparks their attention, makes them receptive to leads, essentially, makes them receptive to engaging with the environment as they see it. So giving them an easy out, like a fast travel system, would undermine that a little bit. That was inspired in part by Prey, which did something very similar.
Right, the arcane, which easier to do in a space station where everything is on top of each other, I guess.
Yeah, but you could just fly around with a jetpack outside and get it. Yeah, so they had some advantages there for sure. But it was another case of like, this is the most aligned with our pillars, so let's try it and see what the result is.
Right.
So for some of what we've discussed as well, it's worth mentioning that we've got play styles at the start of the game. So you can choose to have a more guided experience. You can choose to have a more generous economy. So you can play it more like a traditional kind of like guided quest sort of shooter if you want to. We think the most interesting things happen in the game when you don't have that support structure. So we kind of recommend you play without quest markers. You can turn them on if you want, recommend without. We think the game's the most interesting when you're scrabbling for resources a bit. You can soften that if you want, but we recommend that you don't, etc., etc. Much like we do with the sniper games, where we give you loads of accessibility options and loads of customization options. We do the same thing with Atomfall, but in a even more detailed fashion.
This is a sort of a jerk question, which is why I'll keep it to one of the last ones here to ask. But why do you think people resonated with Atomfall? Because the sort of reception to it has been, games come out and people say, oh, that's a good game, you should play that good game. But I feel like the reception to Atomfall has been more of a, oh, this is like a breath of fresh air. Like this is, it's a very particular type of reception, I think. Were you guys surprised by sort of how well it's done? I know there's public sales figures out there saying it's sold over 1 million in quick amount, and it's probably far exceeded that now. But were you guys surprised? And I guess, were you surprised by the tone of the reception, or was that kind of what you were going for?
Again, you're asking great questions. We were optimistic based on the initial reception of when we announced the game and when we demoed it at Gamescom and things like that. The extent to which people have been excited by it was a very pleasant surprise. So from a certain perspective at Rebellion, we make the sorts of games that we would like to play. Right. And when people engage with those games, that's always very, very pleasant as a sort of surprise that it happens to some extent. I think part of it as well is, like you say, people have commented on it as a breath of fresh air. It's because it does some weird stuff. It's eventually it developed a kind of coherent outlook, a coherent perspective. And as I've described, a lot of that layered up over time, and we kind of found what was interesting over the course of development. So because it's weird in some places, there's a bit of a Marmite reception to that as well, where people that engage with it really engage with it, and the people that aren't engaging with it are, in some cases, bringing assumptions from other games and then saying this game doesn't match these assumptions, so I'm not interested. And that's fine. That's absolutely fair. But that's a necessary consequence of trying something new that some people are very much engaging with. But it's I'm still astounded, like the extent to which people are engaging with it.
Now that it's been a month as well since it's out, and you guys have obviously gotten a bit of air from it, and also watched people playing it, is there any design decision you'd tweak or do something different with? Is there anything that you see players either not engaging with or getting hung up on that you're like, oh, I wish we spent a bit more time on this, or nipped and tucked on this thing?
I mean, that's always true for every aspect of every game I've ever worked on. Like,
all right, you've
always
hour.
got, yeah, exactly. Yeah. So there's always 5 times as many ideas as you've got time to make.
Right.
And that remains true no matter how many games how many ideas you cross off the list, right? You've always got more ideas that you would like to do over time. So we've generated plenty of notes for things that we can nip and tuck while we're working on DLC. As well as an extensive list of things that we would iterate and improve and refine in, like a potential sequel or any game that we make that is informed by Atomfall.
Yeah,
but that list is always a nice big list. I would also love for people to make games that have a lead system instead of a quest system. Not necessarily us. I want to play more of them. I think it's a really interesting mechanic we've kind of discovered, I suppose.
Yeah, absolutely. You've unearthed something really, really cool. Not unlike the scientists in the Lake District.
Nice.
My last question is on you mentioned potential sequel stuff. I want to go back to something you said earlier, which I found really interesting, which was that, like, in another configuration of this development, you might have an outside third party who is demanding, like you said, we want the player to touch as much of this game as possible, yada yada yada. In that situation as well, you might have somebody who wants to make a game that is a bit more sequel friendly than Atomfall is. I'm not saying it's the opposite, that it's antagonistic to the idea of a sequel, but certainly there are games where you could go, oh, let the story continues. Whereas the beauty of Atomfall, I think, in many ways, is that it does feel very cohesive and relatively ties up some bows, certainly in that area. Was that ever a sort of a concern, or I assume the boffins at Rebellion have figured out ways in which you could spin this thing out into different places or different eras or whatnot. But was that ever something that was in your sort of in sort of coming down the pipe, as it were?
So we never let that stop us. Whenever we're developing something, we always have an idea of how you would do more of it, where you could go. In the case of something like Atomfall, the nature of world building means you have to build more story than you have the opportunity to tell, particularly in something that's an interconnected mystery. So there are plenty of plot threads we could pick up and make more of if we wanted to. But like I say, if you try and build too much of a sequel hook, it can come across as kind of arrogant, I suppose, or like you've not finished telling one story. So from my perspective, it's much better to make sure you're telling one good story and use what you've got, right? Don't hold anything back for a theoretical sequel. Just use what you've got, and then that's a high-class problem to have to solve, right? If people engage with the game enough that they want more, it's better to make that first game as good as you possibly can, and then like there are ways that we could easily do an Atomfall 2. We could, and we'd love to, but you don't want to stop yourself making a cool first game.
Yeah, I think a lot of people would love to see it as well. Ben, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us today. Last question. I've never been to the Lake District. What's the sort of the tourist insider? Like, how should you do it? Should you go camping? Should you stay in like one of those little villages? What should you be doing? Fishing out there? Just getting drunk in a local pub? Like, I know what I'd like to do.
You could camp if you want, if you don't mind your tent blowing away. Yeah, it's a lovely area. It's any bit of rural UK, it's very, very nice. Maybe find a nice Airbnb somewhere that won't blow away because it's made of sturdy stones, and go and find a lovely pub nearby to have a couple of drinks.
Smashing. Make sure you get the money from the Lake District tourist council next time around. Ben, thank you so much. I appreciate you taking the time to talk to us today.
Yeah, no problem.